There are more pyramids in a stretch of desert along the Nile in modern Sudan than there are anywhere in Egypt. Not a handful more, by most counts, well over 200 of them, clustered in 3 separate royal cemeteries, steep-sided and comparatively small, rising out of empty sand with almost nobody around to look at them. Most people who could tell you the names of half a dozen Egyptian pharaohs without much effort have never heard the name of a single king buried beneath any of those Sudanese pyramids. And that gap in memory isn't really an accident. It's the tail end of a very long story about a civilization that ruled the Nile for close to 1,000 years, that conquered and governed Egypt itself for nearly a century, that fought the Roman Empire to a negotiated peace when almost nobody else in Rome's orbit managed that, and that left behind a written language we can now read out loud, sound by sound, without being able to tell you what most of it actually means. Tonight's story is about the Kingdom of Kush, an ancient Nubian civilization that rose along the Nile south of Egypt, absorbed and reshaped Egyptian religion and kingship into something distinctly its own, produced a line of kings history calls the Black Pharaohs who ruled the entire Nile from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa, and then, after losing Egypt, rebuilt itself around a new capital far to the south and thrived there for centuries as one of the great iron-working powers of the ancient world. We're going to follow it from a mountain sacred to a god borrowed and made new, through a conquest of Egypt and a war against Assyria, to a queen who humiliated Rome and buried the head of an emperor's statue under her own palace steps as a trophy, and finally to an ending that modern archaeologists are still trying to fully untangle, buried under drifting sand and the ruins its own decline may have helped to cause. If you're getting ready to drift off, let this one settle in slowly. There's no test at the end, just an old, mostly forgotten kingdom with an enormous amount left to say for itself, if only more of us could read what it wrote. Let's go back close to 3,000 years, to a rocky mountain rising out of the desert above a bend in the Nile. Long before the story tonight really begins, the region the ancient Egyptians called Nubia, the stretch of the Nile running south from Egypt's first great cataract, deep into what's now Sudan, had already been home to sophisticated kingdoms of its own for centuries. The Egyptians themselves called part of this land Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, after the skill of its archers, and another name they used for the region, Nub, is generally thought to be the origin of the modern word Nubia itself, meaning gold, a fitting label for a stretch of desert that supplied much of the raw gold flowing into Egyptian temples and treasuries for thousands of years. The earlier kingdom of Kerma, centered a little further south along the Nile, had for a time rivaled Egypt itself in wealth and military power, building enormous mud-brick temple platforms and burying its kings beneath vast circular tumuli surrounded by the remains of hundreds of retainers, before Egyptian New Kingdom pharaohs eventually conquered and colonized the region, folding it into an Egyptian administrative system for roughly 500 years, governed by Egyptian officials who answered to a viceroy bearing the striking title, King's Son of Kush. That long colonial relationship left a permanent mark. By the time Egyptian political control finally weakened and eventually collapsed, around the 11th century BCE, the Nubian elite who filled the resulting power vacuum had thoroughly absorbed Egyptian religion, writing, and royal ideology, and built their new independent kingdom's identity directly out of it. Their capital rose near a solitary flat-topped mountain called Jebel Barkal, which Egyptian priests centuries earlier had already identified as a sacred home of the god Ammonius, believing a natural pinnacle of rock jutting from its summit to be, quite literally, a giant stone cobra crowning the god's earthly dwelling place. The Nubian kings who now controlled that mountain took the association and ran with it completely, styling themselves not as foreign conquerors of Egyptian religious tradition but as its truest and most faithful custodians, a claim that would become central to everything this kingdom did next. That claim reached its fullest, most dramatic expression under a king named Pi, who ruled from Napata, near Jebel Barkal, starting in the mid-8th century BCE, and who looked north at an Egypt fractured into a patchwork of competing local rulers and saw not a foreign country to raid, but a religious and civilizational inheritance that had fallen into disorder and needed, in his own telling, to be properly restored. Around 727 BCE, Pi marched his army down the Nile, and in a campaign he later had carved an extraordinary, almost novelistic detail onto a massive stone stela, a document modern historians consider one of the most vivid pieces of royal narrative writing to survive from the ancient Nile at all. He defeated one rival Egyptian ruler after another, accepted the surrender of others, and made a point, at several captured cities, of personally inspecting the state of local temples before accepting any city's submission, priority given to religious devotion over simple military conquest, at least according to his own account of himself. He took the ancient Egyptian religious capital of Heliopolis, entered its great temple, and performed purification rituals in the traditional Egyptian manner, before famously refusing to enter the palace of one defeated rival king at all, because that king, unlike his Nubian conquerors, had eaten fish, considered ritually impure by Pi's own religious tradition, and was, in Pi's eyes, unworthy of a direct audience despite his surrender. It's a small, strange, deeply human detail buried in an otherwise triumphant conquest narrative, a conqueror who saw himself less as a foreign invader and more as a returning defender of an older, purer version of the very civilization he was subduing. Having accepted the submission of the whole of Egypt, Pi then did something almost stranger still. He loaded his ships with tribute and simply sailed home to Napata, apparently uninterested in ruling day-to-day from within Egypt itself, content instead to have restored what he saw as proper order and returned south to his own sacred mountain. Pi and his successors ruled as Egypt's 25th dynasty, a line of kings modern historians often call the Black Pharaohs, governing the unified Nile from Napata in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north for close to a century, building and restoring temples throughout Egypt on a scale not seen in generations, and reviving older artistic and religious styles deliberately modeled on Egypt's own distant past, right down to bringing back the practice of building steep, small-scale royal pyramids for burial, a style Egypt itself had largely abandoned more than 1,000 years earlier, a Nubian dynasty, in effect, keeping a much older piece of Egyptian tradition alive long after Egypt had moved on from it. One of Pi's successors, a king named Taharqa, presided over the dynasty at what may have been its most genuinely powerful moment, sponsoring an enormous building program that included a striking colonnaded structure at Karnak and a major new temple complex far to the south at a site called Kawa, its walls carved with inscriptions describing his own coronation and his devotion to Ammonius in language as confident and expansive as anything any native Egyptian pharaoh had produced in centuries. Taharqa's reign also brought Kush its first serious external threat, when the expanding Assyrian Empire, already the dominant power across Mesopotamia and the Levant, turned its attention toward Egypt itself. Taharqa is even mentioned, briefly and almost in passing, in the biblical Second Book of Kings, arriving with an army to challenge an Assyrian force besieging Jerusalem, a rare moment where this Nubian dynasty's own historical footprint overlaps directly with a story most listeners will already know from an entirely different tradition. It didn't end well for Kush. Assyrian forces under first Esarhaddon and then his son Ashurbanipal invaded Egypt repeatedly through the following years, eventually sacking Thebes itself and driving the Kushite kings out of Egypt entirely, back south toward Napata, ending the 25th dynasty's century-long rule over a unified Nile. Here's a good moment to get fully settled in if you haven't already, because from here the story moves south, away from the Egypt most listeners already have some picture of, and into a kingdom that kept going for 13 more centuries after most casual histories of ancient Africa quietly stopped paying attention. And if tonight's story is keeping you company, go ahead and hit subscribe now, so the next one is waiting for you without any searching. Back to Napata, and the long, quiet reinvention that followed losing Egypt. Losing Egypt did not end the Kingdom of Kush, it simply redirected it. The kings continued to rule from the Napata region for roughly another 3 centuries, still burying their dead beneath steep pyramids near Jebel Barkal, still maintaining the religious traditions centered on Ammonius that had defined their claim to legitimacy from the start, even as their political reach contracted back to something closer to their original Nubian heartland. Then, sometime around 590 BCE, following a punishing Egyptian military raid deep into Nubian territory under Pharaoh Psamtik II that reportedly reached and damaged Napata itself, the Kushite royal court made a consequential decision. It relocated its administrative center much further south, to a city called Meroë, several hundred miles up the Nile, well beyond easy reach of any future Egyptian army. The move wasn't purely defensive. Meroë sat in a region with far better rainfall and grazing land than the narrow desert-bound Nile Valley around Napata, opening up large-scale cattle herding and cultivation that the older capital's environment had never comfortably supported, and, critically, it sat on top of substantial deposits of iron ore, surrounded by enough scrub forest to fuel the furnaces needed to smelt it at scale. A 20th-century archaeologist working the site, seeing the enormous mounds of iron slag still ringing the city's ruins, half-jokingly nicknamed Meroë, the Birmingham of ancient Africa, after England's own iron-working industrial heartland, and the description, exaggerated or not, points at something real. Meroë grew into one of the major iron-producing centers of the ancient world, exporting worked iron goods, along with ivory, ebony, gold, and cotton textiles, along trade routes reaching the Red Sea, and from there onward toward Arabia and India. Meroë's wealth wasn't built on iron and cattle alone. Sitting at the crossroads of Nile River traffic and overland caravan routes running east toward the Red Sea coast, the kingdom became a genuine hub of long-distance exchange, its potters developing a distinctive, remarkably thin-walled style of decorated fine ware, sometimes called eggshell ware by the modern archaeologists who first handled it, astonished at how delicate it was. That turns up as a prestige trade good at sites far beyond Kush's own borders. Centuries earlier, Ptolemaic Egypt, hungry for war elephants of its own to match the animals used by rival Hellenistic kingdoms further east, had sent hunting expeditions down the Red Sea coast into territory bordering Kushite land specifically in search of live elephants to capture and train, a reminder that this stretch of Africa had already been recognized, long before Rome ever marched south, as a source of resources and expertise the wider Mediterranean world actively wanted access to. That wealth built an extraordinary funerary landscape. Across 3 separate royal cemeteries, one still at Napata's Jebel Barkal, and 2 newer fields at Meroë itself and a nearby site called Nuri, the kings and, notably, a remarkable succession of ruling and co-ruling queens of Kush built well over 200 pyramids across the centuries of the Meroitic kingdom, steeper and considerably smaller than Egypt's own famous examples, but unmistakably part of the same ancient architectural family, reinterpreted on Kush's own terms, their outer chapels carved with funerary scenes that increasingly blended Egyptian iconography with distinctly Nubian imagery, most strikingly, images of a Piedmak, a lion-headed war god who appears nowhere in the Egyptian pantheon at all, worshipped alongside Ammonius in temples the Meroitic kings built specifically for him, a clear sign that whatever this civilization had originally borrowed from Egypt, it had long since grown into something genuinely, independently its own. Several of the most powerful figures in this later period were women who ruled in their own right, carrying the royal title Kandake, a word that would eventually pass, through Greek and Latin transliteration, into the more familiar name Candace. Queens like Ameneshikito and Amanitor commissioned some of the kingdom's grandest surviving monuments, including the Lion Temple at Naka, its walls carved with images of these ruling queens standing alongside their kings in full royal regalia, wielding weapons and receiving offerings with exactly the same visual authority Egyptian art traditionally reserved for male pharaohs alone. That royal title carried an unexpectedly long afterlife of its own. Several centuries after Ameneshikito and Amanitor built their temples, the title Kandake surfaces again in an entirely different text, one far more familiar to modern audiences than any Meroitic inscription, the biblical Book of Acts, which describes an Ethiopian court official, treasurer to Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, traveling home from Jerusalem and being baptized along the road after a chance encounter with the Apostle Philip. Biblical scholars generally understand that Ethiopia, in this Greco-Roman context, to mean the Nile Kingdom of Kush rather than the modern nation of the same name, and Candace, not as a personal name at all, but as a garbled Greek rendering of the same royal title, Kandake, that Amenarines and her fellow ruling queens had carried generations earlier, meaning that a title invented by Meroitic Nubian queens to describe their own royal authority had, by pure linguistic accident, worked its way into one of the most widely read religious texts in human history, still repeated today by readers who mostly have no idea it once belonged to a real line of African queens ruling from pyramids on the Nile. Away from the pyramids, the Meroitic kingdom also left behind some remarkable feats of practical engineering that had nothing to do with royal burial at all. Because rainfall this far from the Nile's main channel was seasonal and unreliable, Meroitic engineers built enormous artificial reservoirs called hafers, some of them hundreds of feet across, dug directly into the desert floor and sometimes lined or reinforced to reduce seepage, capable of storing enough seasonal rainwater to sustain large herds of cattle and sizable settlements well away from the riverbank itself, effectively expanding the amount of habitable, farmable land the kingdom could support far beyond the narrow strip most Nile civilizations were confined to. Not far from Meroë itself sits an enormous, still only partially explained ceremonial complex called Musawarat Sufra, its ruins a sprawling maze of ramps, courtyards, and chambers decorated with carved images of elephants, leading some archaeologists to propose it may have functioned, at least in part, as a site connected to the training or ceremonial display of war elephants, animals the Meroitic kingdom is known to have used in battle, following a military fashion for elephant warfare that had spread across much of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world in the centuries after Alexander the Great's campaigns introduced war elephants to a much wider audience. Other researchers read the same site as primarily a royal coronation center or a place of pilgrimage tied to the god Apidmak. Like a great deal about Meroitic religious life, the honest answer is that specialists are still working it out. The most famous of these queens, a Kandake named Amenarines, led Kush into direct armed conflict with the Roman Empire around 24 BCE, after Rome, freshly consolidating control over newly annexed Egypt, pushed its own garrisons aggressively south into territory Kush considered its own. Ancient Greek and Roman writers who recorded the conflict, including the geographer Strabo, describe Amenarines as a striking, formidable figure who had reportedly lost an eye in earlier fighting and led her own forces in the field despite it. Her army struck first, sacking several southern Egyptian towns and, in a detail that has survived vividly into the present, toppling and beheading a bronze statue of the Roman Emperor Augustus, carrying its severed head hundreds of miles south as a war trophy and burying it beneath the entrance steps of a Meroitic temple, deliberately positioned, Archaeologists who eventually excavated it in the 20th century concluded, so that anyone walking into the building would forever be stepping, unknowingly or not, directly over the emperor's own buried face. That very head, remarkably lifelike and still bearing traces of its original paint, survives today in the British Museum, one of the most striking pieces of physical evidence anywhere for a war most people have never heard fought at all. Rome retaliated with a punitive campaign of its own, and years of intermittent fighting followed, until the two sides eventually negotiated a peace treaty, reportedly ratified in person by the Emperor Augustus himself, on terms that, remarkably, left Kush's independence and territory essentially intact and even cancelled a tribute payment Rome had initially demanded, a genuinely rare outcome for any kingdom that went to war directly against Rome at the height of its imperial expansion, and won. That speaks to just how seriously Roman commanders on the ground had come to take Kushite military strength. What makes this whole flourishing period even stranger to look back on now is how much of it we still can't actually read. Sometime during the Meroitic era, Kush developed its own fully independent writing system, adapted loosely from Egyptian demotic script but restructured into a genuinely alphabetic set of symbols, a remarkably compact system of roughly 23 signs, used in two related forms, one for formal monumental hieroglyphic-style carving and a faster cursive version for everyday writing. And by several centuries into the Common Era it had almost entirely replaced Egyptian hieroglyphs on royal monuments across the kingdom. In the early 20th century, a British Egyptologist named Francis Llewellyn Griffith worked through the surviving inscriptions and, drawing on a handful of bilingual texts and proper names that also appeared in Egyptian or Greek sources, successfully cracked the script's phonetic values between roughly 1909 and 1911, meaning that today, specialists really can pick up a Meroitic inscription and read it aloud, sound by sound, essentially as its original writer intended it to be spoken. And there the progress mostly stops. Meroitic, the language itself, remains, even now, only partially understood. It isn't closely related to Egyptian, and its precise relationship to other African language families is still genuinely debated among linguists, with some researchers proposing distant connections to language groups spoken today far to the south and west, and no clear surviving relative offering an easy bridge into translating full sentences beyond a limited working vocabulary built up laboriously, word by word, from context and repetition across a few hundred surviving funerary texts, most of them frustratingly formulaic, offering formulas rather than the kind of longer narrative or administrative writing that might have let linguists reconstruct real grammar. It's a strange, specific kind of archaeological frustration, hundreds of inscriptions, carved with obvious care by a literate, sophisticated civilization, that modern scholars can pronounce with real confidence and still, in most cases, cannot fully translate. The kingdom's eventual decline, when it came, arrived slowly and remains, even now, genuinely disputed among the archaeologists who study it. One major theory points inward, at Meroë's own industrial success. Centuries of iron production demanded a continuous supply of wood charcoal for the smelting furnaces, and some researchers argue that the resulting deforestation across the region surrounding the capital gradually degraded the local environment, undermining the agricultural base that had made Meroë such an attractive capital in the first place. An ancient kingdom, in this reading, slowly consuming the very resource base that had made it wealthy. Other researchers point outward, to shifting trade patterns as Red Sea and Indian Ocean commerce increasingly bypassed the older Nile corridor routes in favor of newer maritime networks running further east, quietly starving Meroë of the trade revenue its economy had come to depend on, while still other archaeologists point to growing pressure from nomadic groups pressing in from the surrounding deserts, including the Blemmyes and the Nubia, whose raids and eventual settlement across former Kushite territory appear with increasing frequency in the archaeological and textual record of the kingdom's final centuries. There's a specific, dramatic-sounding piece of evidence that seems, on closer examination, to explain rather less than it first appears to. Around 350 CE, a king of the rising kingdom of Aksum, in what's now Ethiopia and Eritrea, a ruler named Ezana, had an inscription carved describing a military campaign against a region called Kush, claiming to have defeated its forces, burned its cities, and destroyed its granaries and cotton stores. For a long time this was treated as the clean, decisive answer to what had ended the Meroitic kingdom, a triumphant rival striking the final blow and leaving a written confession of it behind. But more recent archaeological work at Meroë itself has complicated that tidy story considerably. Excavations increasingly suggest the city was already in serious decline, its royal building programs largely stalled, its population contracting, and its pyramid field seeing its last significant royal burials, well before Ezana's campaign is generally dated. Which would mean the Aksumite king may have been claiming credit for finishing off a kingdom that was already most of the way to collapse on its own, for reasons still argued over today, rather than single-handedly toppling it. In the centuries that followed, the old Kushite heartland along the Nile didn't stay empty. New Nubian successor kingdoms, among them Nobatia, Makuria, and Alwa, eventually emerged from the same region, some of them, remarkably, converting to Christianity centuries before large parts of northern Europe did, carrying fragments of the older Nubian identity forward in a transformed shape, long after the name Kush itself had faded from active use. Much of what's known about that later Christian Nubian world only came to light because of a different kind of urgency entirely. In the 1960s, as Egypt built the Aswan High Dam and the rising waters of the new Lake Nasser threatened to permanently submerge huge stretches of the ancient Nubian Nile, an international UNESCO salvage campaign raced to document and, where possible, physically relocate what it could before the flooding began. Alongside the famous, headline-grabbing relocation of the temples at Abu Simbel, archaeologists working at a site called Faris uncovered an entire Nubian Christian cathedral whose interior walls were covered in vividly preserved painted portraits of bishops, saints, and Nubian royalty, images that would otherwise now be resting permanently under dozens of feet of reservoir water, salvaged in a race against a rising deadline that, in its own smaller way, mirrors the much longer, slower race. Modern archaeologists are still running to understand everything that came before it. What's not in dispute is what happened to what was left behind, many centuries later, at the hands of people who should have known better. We still don't know, with real confidence, how much of Meroë's decline was self-inflicted by its own industrial success, how much was driven by trade routes moving elsewhere entirely outside its control, or exactly how much truth sits inside Ezana's proud claim to have finished the kingdom off himself. We don't fully understand, even now, most of what the Meroitic people who built 200 pyramids and buried an emperor's head under their own doorstep were actually trying to say to us, word by word, in the language they left carved in stone. What we do know is that a civilization capable of conquering Egypt, humbling Rome's ambitions on its own southern frontier, and building a funerary landscape larger than Egypt's own, can still end up remembered, if it's remembered at all, mostly as a footnote to the much more famous kingdom it once ruled. Before you drift off, I'd love to know, had you ever heard of the Kingdom of Kush before tonight, or was this the first time an African civilization this size had ever crossed your radar? Let me know in the comments, and if this kept you company, go ahead and subscribe so the next forgotten chapter is waiting for you. Somewhere under that flat-topped mountain in the Sudanese desert, and under 200 small stone pyramids scattered across the sand beside it, an emperor's buried bronze face is still there, still facing up, still waiting for footsteps that mostly never come. Sleep well.